The notification hit my phone at 6:12 a.m., sharp and cold, like it had been waiting for me to wake up. Account balance update. I didn't even have to open it to know something was wrong. My chest tightened before my eyes ever touched the screen. When I did open it, the numbers confirmed what my body already understood. Our joint account was empty. Not low, not suspiciously reduced. Empty. Every dollar gone like it had never existed. The savings we talked about for emergencies, the cushion he promised we were building together, drained overnight with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone heavy in my hand, the room too quiet for what had just happened. The other side of the mattress was already cold. He'd left the night before with a duffel bag and a rehearsed speech about needing space. I didn't know then that space was just a distraction. This was the real exit. I checked the credit card apps next, one by one. Declined, canceled, closed. Notifications stacked on top of each other like insults. He hadn't just left me emotionally, he'd cut the financial oxygen too. Clean, efficient, planned. Friends would later tell me I should have panicked, that I should have called a lawyer immediately, screamed, begged, done something dramatic. But in that moment, I didn't do any of that. I didn't even cry right away. I just sat there, breathing slowly, letting the truth settle into my bones. This wasn't impulsive. This was intentional. I thought back to all the times he'd insisted on managing the big stuff, how he framed it as protection, how he'd said, "I've got us," whenever I asked too many questions. I remembered the way he joked about money like it was a game he always knew how to win. I remembered feeling small for wanting more transparency, more clarity, more control over my own life. The hurt came next, deep, personal, not just because of the money, but because of what it said about him, about us, about how easily he chose to leave me exposed. The man who said he loved me had no problem imagining me broke, scared, scrambling. That realization cracked something open in my chest that had nothing to do with finances. I stood up slowly and walked into the kitchen, bare feet cold against the tile. The house felt different now, lighter in some places, heavier in others. His mug still sat in the sink, his jacket hung by the door, evidence of a life he'd already decided was over. I made coffee with shaking hands and forced myself to drink it, forced myself to stay present. Panic would come later if it needed to. Right now, I needed clarity. I opened my laptop and pulled up the banking history, scrolling through transactions I hadn't approved, transfers I hadn't been warned about. It was all there in black and white. He really thought he'd taken everything. I almost laughed, a short, bitter sound that surprised even me, because while he was so busy emptying what we shared, he'd forgotten something important, something he never paid attention to, something I'd built quietly, patiently, without drama or announcements, an account in my name. I hadn't opened it out of spite. I hadn't opened it planning an escape. I'd opened it years ago, on a day when his tone felt off, when a conversation about money ended with me feeling dismissed instead of secure. It was instinct, survival, a small voice in my head saying, just in case. Overtime pay, bonuses, tax refunds, money I tucked away when life felt unstable and I couldn't explain why. I never hid it, I just didn't advertise it. And over time, it grew into something solid, something untouched by his decisions. I logged in and stared at the balance, my breath finally catching. Relief flooded me so fast, my eyes burned. Not joy, not triumph, relief. The kind that keeps you from collapsing when the ground gives way. He thought he'd won. He thought I was about to beg. I closed the laptop, picked up my phone, and let his missed calls sit unanswered. Let him believe the silence meant devastation. Let him imagine me scrambling, afraid, cornered. I wasn't ready to move yet. Not today. Today was for understanding what really happened, for mourning what I'd lost emotionally, for accepting that the man I married had chosen cruelty when he could have chosen decency. But tomorrow I would start rebuilding, and he would never see it coming. The first thing I did after the shock settled was nothing. That sounds strange, I know, but stillness was the only power I had in those first hours, and I wasn't about to give it away. I didn't call him. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call my friends who loved me loudly and panicked quickly. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, as if every step needed to be mine again. I opened the refrigerator and noticed what was missing before I noticed what remained. His favorite drinks, gone. The leftovers he'd promised to finish, gone. Even absence, I was learning, can be intentional. I leaned against the counter and finally let the tears come. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that slid down my face while I stared at the floor. I wasn't crying because of the money. I was crying because of the calculation, because this man had looked at our life and decided the cleanest way out was to leave me exposed. No conversation, no warning, just a financial ambush followed by silence. That kind of betrayal doesn't come from anger alone. It comes from certainty, the certainty that you don't see the other person as someone who deserves protection. By midday, my phone buzzed with messages. Friends who noticed my cards declined at brunch. My sister asking if everything was okay. A coworker checking in after I'd missed a meeting. I responded to none of them. Not yet. I needed time to understand my own emotions before managing anyone else's fear on my behalf. I sat at the dining table with a notebook and wrote everything down. Dates, account names, amounts. Every shared asset he touched, every financial move that had been made without me. I didn't do it because I was spiraling. I did it because documentation is grounding. It reminds you that reality exists outside your emotions. When I finished, I turned the page and wrote one sentence at the top in bold ink. I am not powerless. That afternoon, I logged into the account he didn't know about again, not to admire the balance, but to plan. Rent deposits, retainers, therapy, groceries, time. Time was the most valuable thing that account gave me. I wasn't rushing from fear. I was choosing from clarity. He finally called around 3:47 p.m. I watched his name light up the screen and felt nothing sharp rise in me. No panic, no rage, just a strange calm. I let it ring, then ring again, then stop. A voicemail followed, his voice carefully neutral, like he was rehearsing a version of himself that could still be admired. Hey, just checking in. I know this is hard. We'll talk soon. We. I almost laughed. We had ended the moment he decided to take everything and leave me with nothing. There was no we left to consult, only consequences he hadn't calculated yet. That night, I slept better than I expected, not because I felt safe, but because I felt prepared. I woke up once, heart racing, imagining worst-case scenarios. Then I reminded myself the worst had already happened. He showed me who he was. Everything after that was just logistics. The next morning, I scheduled 3 things: an appointment with a lawyer, an intake session with a therapist, a tour of a small apartment across town. I didn't do any of it out of revenge. I did it out of respect for myself, for the woman who'd listened to her instincts years ago when something felt off and acted quietly without drama or permission. As I got dressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Puffy eyes, tired face, but something else too, a steadiness I hadn't seen before. I wasn't scrambling, I wasn't begging, I wasn't frozen. I was moving. And while he was out there assuming I was drowning, I was learning how to swim in water he didn't even know existed. The truth was simple. even if it was painful. He didn't forget that account by accident. He forgot me, and that mistake was about to cost him more than money. The lawyer's office smelt like lemon cleaner and old paper, the kind of place where other people's endings were cataloged neatly in filing cabinets. I sat in the chair across from her desk, hands folded tightly in my lap, listening as she reviewed the documents I'd brought. Every now and then she'd pause, adjust her glasses, and look at me with a kind of measured concern that told me she already knew how bad this was. "He emptied the joint accounts," she said, tapping her pen against the page. "Canceled shared credit? That's aggressive, but not uncommon." I nodded. Hearing it described so plainly made it feel less personal and more procedural, which helped. Betrayal is easier to face when it's stripped of romance. "What about your individual assets?" she asked. I hesitated for half a second, not because I was unsure, but because saying it out loud made it real. "I have an account in my own name," I said carefully. "Opened years ago. He doesn't have access." Her pen stopped moving. "That changes things," she said. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, just factually. And in that moment I understood something important. Preparation doesn't make you heartless, it makes you survivable. She explained my options calmly. Asset tracing, temporary orders, protections. I listened, asked questions, took notes. Not once did she suggest I should have trusted him more. Not once did she imply I was foolish for not seeing this coming sooner. That mattered more than I expected. When I left her office, the afternoon sun felt harsh against my eyes. I sat in my car for a long moment before turning the key, letting the weight of everything settle. I wasn't winning, not yet, but I wasn't losing either. I was standing in the narrow space between devastation and recovery, and for the first time since he walked out, I trusted myself to navigate it. The apartment tour came next. It wasn't fancy. One bedroom, small kitchen, old floors that creaked when I walked across them. But it was clean, quiet, and most importantly, mine. I ran my hand along the window frame and imagined mornings without tension, nights without listening for his keys at the door, days that didn't revolve around managing someone else's moods. I signed the application that same afternoon. That night, I told my sister the truth. Not all of it, just enough. She was furious on my behalf, her voice rising with every sentence. She wanted to call him, confront him, expose him. I let her finish, then said quietly, "I've got it handled." The words surprised both of us. After we hung up, I sat alone on the couch and let the silence wrap around me. I realized then how much of my marriage had been noise, constant explanations, justifications, negotiations. The quiet felt unfamiliar, but not threatening. It felt honest. He texted again around midnight. "Can we talk tomorrow? I'm worried about you." I stared at the message for a long time. The audacity almost impressed me. He had emptied our accounts without hesitation, yet here he was, performing concern like it might still earn him access to me. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. In the end, I sent nothing. The next few days passed in a blur of logistics, movers, deposits, password changes. I rerouted my paycheck, updated my mailing address, locked down my credit. Every small action felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been quietly siphoned away over the years. But nights were harder. At night, the questions crept in. How long had he planned this? Had he always seen me as temporary? Was I naive for loving him the way I did? I lay awake replaying conversations, re-examining moments that now carried new meaning. Every laugh that covered dismissal, every promise that came with conditions. And yet, beneath the grief, something else was growing. Resolve. He wanted me panicked, disoriented, dependent. He wanted me calling him, asking how I was supposed to survive with what he took. What he didn't understand was that I'd already survived the hardest part, the moment I realized the person beside me was capable of this kind of harm. Everything else was just rebuilding. The following week, my therapist asked me a question that stopped me cold. When did you start preparing for this? I thought about it honestly, about the first deposit, the first time I chose caution over comfort, the first time I listened to that quiet inner voice instead of dismissing it as insecurity. Before I knew I needed to, I said. She nodded. That tells me you trusted yourself long before you trusted him. Driving home afterward, those words echoed in my mind. Trusted myself. I'd never framed it that way before. I'd always thought of that account as fear, as pessimism, as something I should have felt guilty about. Now I saw it differently. It was love. Love for a future version of me who might need a lifeline. Love for my own safety. Love that didn't require permission. And just as I was beginning to feel steady in that truth, my phone rang. This time it wasn't him. It was the bank. And the words they said next made my stomach drop all over again. The bank representative spoke gently, the way people do when they're trained to deliver bad news without taking responsibility for how it lands. Ma'am, we noticed unusual activity tied to your former joint accounts and wanted to verify a few things. Former. The word stung more than it should have. She explained that there had been multiple attempts, unsuccessful so far, to access accounts linked to my name. Password resets requested, identity verification questions triggered. Someone was trying to move money they no longer had permission to touch. I didn't need her to say his name. My hands went cold as I listened, every instinct sharpening at once. He hadn't stopped at draining what he could reach. He was searching, probing, digging for what he assumed must exist if I wasn't panicking the way he expected. That realization hurt in a new way. He wasn't just trying to leave me broke, he was trying to make sure I stayed that way. I thanked the representative and asked her to lock everything down immediately. New passwords, two-factor authentication, alerts for every transaction, no matter how small. She complied without hesitation, and when the call ended, I sat very still, staring at the wall as my heart pounded. So this was the next move. I thought back to his voicemail, the carefully neutral concern, the "we'll talk soon." It hadn't been concern at all. It had been reconnaissance. He wanted to know if I was struggling, if I'd discovered anything he missed, if there was still something left for him to take. The calm I'd been holding on to cracked just enough to let anger seep through. Not explosive anger, focused anger, the kind that straightens your spine and clears your vision. I called my lawyer immediately and told her everything. She wasn't surprised, not even a little. "This is why we move quickly," she said. "He's realizing you're not as helpless as he planned." We filed additional protections that afternoon, formal separation notices, financial restraints, paper trails that would make every future attempt traceable. Each signature felt like another door closing behind me, another boundary solidified in ink. That evening, he texted again. "Why is the bank calling me about access issues?" There it was, the mask slipping. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling something close to pity rise in my chest, quickly followed by clarity. I didn't owe him explanations, I didn't owe him reassurance, and I certainly didn't owe him access to the truth. I replied with one sentence, "Please direct all financial questions to my attorney." The typing bubbles appeared, disappeared, appeared again, then nothing. Silence stretched between us, heavy but different now. This silence wasn't abandonment, it was protection. That night, alone in my new apartment, I unpacked slowly, folded clothes, placed books on shelves, made the bed with sheets I'd chosen myself. Every small act felt intentional, like staking a claim on a life that no longer required negotiation. But when I lay down to sleep, my mind refused to rest. I wondered how long he'd been planning this, whether he'd rehearsed the moment he'd walk away believing he'd won, whether he was angry now or scared. I wondered how many women before me had been undone by this exact strategy and blamed themselves for not seeing it coming. And then I remembered the account, the one he didn't know about, the one he was circling now without realizing he'd already lost the chance to touch it. That account wasn't just money anymore. It was leverage. And as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought settled into my chest with unsettling clarity. He was about to realize I wasn't surviving by accident. I was surviving by design. And the moment he fully understood that, everything between us would change. The moment I realized he was scared, something inside me finally unclenched. Fear has a sound. It's subtle, but once you recognize it, you can't unhear it. It's in the sudden politeness, the cautious wording, the way questions start replacing statements. His messages shifted overnight, from confident assumptions to probing curiosity. He wasn't asking how I felt anymore. He was asking how I was managing. How are you holding up? Did you find a place yet? Are you okay financially? Each one landed like a quiet confession. If he truly believed he'd taken everything, he wouldn't need to ask. I didn't answer. Instead, I focused on the mechanics of rebuilding. I transferred a portion of my savings into a new account at a different bank. I set aside funds specifically for legal costs and therapy, so they were mentally accounted for, not looming threats. I created a budget that wasn't about restriction, but sustainability. For the first time in years, my money felt calm. Therapy helped me name what I'd been avoiding. I feel embarrassed, I admitted one afternoon, staring at the carpet. Not because he left, but because he thought I was someone he could do this to. My therapist nodded gently. She said that says everything about his character and nothing about your worth. Still, the shame lingered in quiet corners. I avoided certain friends. I chose silence over explaining. Not because I was weak, but because I was healing, and healing doesn't owe anyone a performance. One evening, as I unpacked the last box in my apartment, I found an old envelope tucked between books. Inside were bank statements from the first year I opened that account. The balances were small, almost laughable. $50 here, $100 there. I sat on the floor reading them, my chest tightening. I remembered exactly who I was then, tired, uncertain, loving someone who dismissed my concerns with a smile. I remembered telling myself, just in case, without knowing what that case would be. I trusted a future version of me enough to protect her, even when I couldn't fully articulate why. That realization broke something open. I hadn't been preparing for divorce, I'd been preparing for truth. The call came 2 weeks later. I didn't recognize the number at first, but the moment I answered, I knew. His voice was different, lower, careful. Gone was the confidence he'd carried when he walked out believing he'd won. "I just wanted to check in," he said. "I'm concerned." Concerned. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes, not in exhaustion, in clarity. "I'm doing well," I said simply. There was a pause, too long. "How?" he asked before he could stop himself. There it was, the question he'd been circling since the bank shut him out, the question that confirmed everything I already knew. I smiled to myself, not out of cruelty, but relief. "I planned," I said. That was all. I didn't explain, I didn't justify, I didn't reveal the account or the numbers or the safety net he'd never bothered to ask about. I let the mystery sit between us like a mirror. We ended the call shortly after. When I hung up, my hands were steady, my breathing even. Whatever power he thought he'd taken from me was gone, not because I'd hidden something, but because I'd reclaimed myself. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since he left, not because the danger was over, but because I finally understood this. I didn't survive because he forgot that account. I survived because I never forgot myself. And the next time he reached out, it wouldn't be with curiosity. It would be with regret. And I wasn't sure yet how I planned to handle that, but I knew one thing for certain. I would do it on my terms. Regret has weight. I felt it the next time he called, even before I answered. It sat in the pause between rings, in the way my phone vibrated just a little longer than usual, like it already knew this conversation wouldn't be simple. I let it ring twice before picking up, not to punish him, but to remind myself I had choice now. His voice cracked through the lines softer than I remembered, not broken, just altered. "I didn't mean for things to get this bad," he said. That sentence used to undo me. It was his favorite escape hatch, but this time it landed differently, because intent doesn't erase impact, and apologies that arrive after leverage is gone are just confessions wearing guilt as camouflage. "You drained the accounts," I said evenly. "That wasn't an accident." He sighed, long and theatrical, said he was angry, said he felt pushed, said he didn't think I'd be left with nothing. That last part almost made me laugh. "You didn't think about what I'd be left with at all," I replied. Silence. I could hear him recalibrating in real time, searching for a version of himself that still had authority here. When he spoke again, the tone had shifted, careful, strategic. "I just need to understand how you're managing," he said. "I'm struggling." There it was. Not concern for me, curiosity about survival, fear that I wasn't drowning the way he needed me to be for his story to work. "I'm managing," I repeated. "That's all you need to know." I ended the call before he could ask anything else. Afterward, I sat on the couch, staring at the wall, surprised by how little adrenaline was left in my body. No shaking, no racing thoughts, just a deep, grounded awareness that something fundamental had changed. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was responding. The lawyer confirmed a week later that his attempts to access my finances had been documented. Each failed login, each inquiry, each phone call logged and time-stamped. She said it calmly, like she was reading the weather report. "If this escalates, we're protected," she said. Protected. I rolled the word around in my mouth after the call ended. I'd spent so much of my life protecting other people's feelings, smoothing situations, absorbing discomfort so things didn't get ugly. Now I was learning what it felt like to protect myself without apology. Work stabilized too. I informed HR of my address change, updated emergency contacts, redirected benefits. No drama, no explanations beyond what was necessary. The world didn't collapse because my marriage did. Bills still arrived, deadlines still existed, life continued, indifferent and steady. One night as I balanced my budget, I realized something startling. I wasn't just okay, I was ahead. The account I'd built quietly over the years wasn't just a lifeline, it was momentum. It bought me time, yes, but it also bought me options. I could choose peace. I could choose therapy twice a week if I needed it. I could choose rest without guilt. I could choose not to rush into survival mode just to prove I was strong. That freedom made me emotional in a way I hadn't expected. I cried, not from loss, but from relief, because I finally understood that trusting myself hadn't been paranoia, it had been wisdom, and wisdom doesn't announce itself. It whispers, and you either listen or you don't. He texted again late one night. "I never thought you'd shut me out like this." I stared at the message, feeling no urge to defend myself. "You shut me out first," I typed, then deleted it. I didn't send anything. Some lessons don't need explanation, they just need distance. As the weeks passed, his messages slowed, became shorter, less frequent. The power dynamic was correcting itself, settling into something truer. He no longer sounded curious, he sounded ashamed. And that's when I knew the next phase was coming, because shame doesn't stay quiet forever. It either turns inward or it demands one last conversation. And I could feel that moment approaching. The message came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet day where you don't expect emotional ambushes. "Can we meet? I need to explain myself." I stared at the screen longer than I needed to, not because I was tempted, but because I was measuring what this would cost me emotionally. Healing teaches you that closure isn't something other people give you, it's something you decide you're finished needing. Still, I agreed, not for him, for me. I chose a public cafe, midday, neutral ground. I wasn't walking back into old dynamics behind closed doors. He was already there when I arrived, sitting stiffly at a corner table. He looked older, not dramatically, but worn, like someone who'd been holding a narrative together and finally realized it wasn't convincing anymore. When he saw me, his face softened in a way that once would have pulled me right back in. It didn't this time. We exchanged brief pleasantries, ordered coffee, avoided eye contact, then he sighed and leaned forward, hands clasped like a man about to confess something noble. "I messed up," he said. "I was angry. I wasn't thinking clearly." I let the words hang between us. "You planned it," I replied calmly. "You didn't just leave. You stripped the accounts, canceled cards, and tried to access money that wasn't yours anymore." His jaw tightened. "I didn't think you had anything else." There it was again. Not regret for the harm, shock that I wasn't destitute. I felt something like sadness then, not for us, but for the clarity of the moment. This was the truth he'd been hiding from me, and maybe even from himself. He hadn't just wanted to leave, he wanted me dependent. "I trusted you," I said quietly, "and you chose to hurt me where you thought I'd never recover." He reached for my hand. I pulled it back gently but firmly. "Don't," I said. "That version of access is gone." His eyes filled, and for a moment I saw the man I'd loved, the one who laughed with me in grocery store aisles, the one who once promised to protect me. But I also saw the man who emptied accounts without hesitation. Both could exist, but only one got to matter now. "I just want to know how you're okay," he said softly. I took a sip of my coffee and met his eyes. "I'm okay because I trusted myself when you didn't. That's the difference." He nodded slowly like he was absorbing something too late to use. We sat in silence after that, the clink of cups and low chatter filling the space where excuses had run out. When I stood to leave, he looked up at me and asked, "Do you hate me?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said, "but I don't need you anymore." That answer seemed to hurt more than anger ever could. As I walked out into the sunlight, I felt lighter than I had in months, not because he understood, but because I didn't need him to. Later that night, I transferred the final shared utility bills into my name and closed the last joint account permanently. I watched the confirmation screen like a closing ceremony, quiet, final, dignified. I wasn't erasing him, I was reclaiming myself. And as I lay in bed that night, one thought kept repeating, steady and sure. The account he forgot about didn't just save me from ruin, it saved me from going back. But I also knew something else was coming, because men who lose control rarely lose interest quietly, and I could feel one last attempt approaching. The last attempt didn't come as anger. It came as vulnerability. 2 days after we met, he sent a long message just after midnight. Paragraphs instead of sentences. Apologies layered with memory. He talked about our early years, about how hard things had been, about how scared he was of starting over. He said he felt replaced, not by another person, but by my independence. That line stood out to me more than anything else. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of no longer being needed. I read the message once, then again, slowly, carefully, not because it pulled me back, but because I wanted to understand it without emotion clouding the truth. There was remorse in his words, but it was self-centered remorse, regret for consequences, not for choices, grief over his discomfort, not my pain. He ended the message with a question. "Is there any chance we can try again?" I set my phone down and stared at the ceiling, heart steady, mind clear. Months ago, that question would have sent me spiraling, debating, analyzing, searching for the version of him I hoped still existed. Now, it felt like a door I'd already walked past. I didn't answer that night. The next morning, I woke early and went for a walk before work. The air was cool, the streets quiet, the city just beginning to stretch awake. With each step, I felt more grounded in my body than I had in years. This was what safety felt like. Not certainty about the future, but trust in myself to handle it. At work, I signed off on a project that would have once required his input. No hesitation, no second guessing. I caught myself smiling at the ease of it. Power doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels peaceful. That afternoon, I finally replied, "I'm not interested in trying again. I wish you well." No explanation, no apology, no invitation for debate. His response came fast. "So that's it?" "Yes," I typed. And that was the end of the conversation. What surprised me wasn't his silence afterward, it was mine. No ache followed, no guilt, no sense of cruelty, just a quiet acknowledgement that some chapters end not because they're resolved, but because they're no longer relevant. That night, I reviewed my finances again, not out of fear, but pride. The account balance hadn't changed much, but I had. That money represented years of listening to myself when no one else was paying attention. It represented resilience built in small, unglamorous choices. I realized then that I didn't need to keep that account separate forever. It had served its purpose. It had carried me through the storm. Soon I would integrate it into a broader plan, investments, long-term security, a future designed with intention instead of reaction. But not yet. For now, it remained what it had always been, proof. Proof that I had trusted myself long before the world demanded that I do. Proof that survival doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks quiet preparation. And proof that being underestimated can be the greatest protection of all. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I felt something new settle into me. Not closure, freedom. And with that freedom came a deeper understanding. This story wasn't just about the account he forgot about. It was about the woman he forgot to reckon with. And she was finally ready to live without looking over her shoulder. Freedom is louder after midnight. That's when the old habits try to sneak back in, when the world goes quiet enough for your thoughts to raise their voices. I noticed it the first night after I told him no. The apartment was still. No texts, no calls, no emotional fallout, just me and the hum of the refrigerator, the city breathing outside my window. And yet, my body stayed alert. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the threat is gone. It lingers in muscle memory, in the way your shoulders tense when your phone lights up, in the instinct to rehearse explanations you no longer owe. I caught myself doing it, planning imaginary conversations where I justified my choices, defended my boundaries, softened my truth. I stopped mid-thought. Who was I still explaining myself to? That question followed me into therapy the next day. I told her about the cafe, the message, the final no, about how proud I was and how unsettled I felt afterward. She listened, nodding, then said something that landed deeper than she probably intended. Your nervous system is catching up to your boundaries. I let that sit. She explained that for years, my safety had depended on anticipation, reading moods, managing outcomes, staying one step ahead. Now, I didn't need to do that anymore, but my body hadn't learned the update yet. It was still bracing for impact that wasn't coming. "Give it time," she said. "You're learning a new language, peace." That word felt unfamiliar in my mouth. Peace. At work, the shift was noticeable. I spoke more directly in meetings. I delegated without guilt. I stopped volunteering for tasks that drained me just to be seen as cooperative. No one pushed back. In fact, things ran smoother. I realized how often women are taught to confuse self-sacrifice with professionalism and how unnecessary that lesson really is. One afternoon, a colleague pulled me aside and said, "You seem lighter." I smiled politely, but inside, I felt something crack open. I was lighter, not because life was easy, but because it was honest. I wasn't managing a double reality anymore. I wasn't protecting someone else's image at the expense of my own stability. I wasn't pretending not to see what was right in front of me. At home, I began unpacking parts of myself I tucked away during the marriage. Old hobbies, music I used to love, books I stopped reading because they made him uncomfortable. Even small things like how I decorated my space became acts of reclamation. Plants by the window, art that didn't need approval, silence that didn't feel like punishment. The account sat quietly in the background, untouched but present, a reminder, not a fear, but foresight. I checked it occasionally, not to reassure myself, but to stay connected to the woman who'd built it deposit by deposit long before she knew why. One evening, while organizing paperwork, I found an old note I'd written years ago and forgotten about, just a scrap of paper tucked into a folder. "If something ever happens, don't freeze." I stared at it for a long time. That woman had known more than I gave her credit for. She hadn't predicted betrayal, but she'd anticipated the need for herself, and in doing so, she'd saved me from something worse than financial ruin. She'd saved me from staying. The finality of that truth hit me slowly. My marriage hadn't ended because of money. The money just revealed the truth sooner than denial would have allowed. He didn't drain the accounts because he was desperate. He drained them because he assumed I would be. That assumption changed everything. As weeks passed, the echoes of his presence faded, not dramatically, but steadily. His name stopped triggering reactions. His memory lost its sharp edges. I stopped wondering what he was doing, who he was with, whether he regretted it. Those questions belonged to a version of me who needed validation to move on. This version didn't. One night, as I balanced my checkbook and updated my long-term goals, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was building without qualifiers. Not after divorce, not despite betrayal, just building. And that's when I understood the real gift of the account he forgot about. It didn't just give me money, it gave me time to become someone he could no longer reach. And as I closed my laptop and turned off the light, I knew the story was moving toward its final truth. Not about what he took, but about what he never had the power to touch. The first real sign that I had crossed into a new chapter came quietly, without drama. It was a Thursday morning, ordinary in every way. I stood in my kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counter, coffee brewing, calendar notifications popping up on my phone. For the first time in months, none of them made my stomach tighten. There was no hidden threat lurking behind the day, no financial fear waiting to ambush me. That was when it hit me. I was no longer living in response to him. For so long, every decision I made had been shaped by what he might think, say, or do. Even after he left, his absence still dictated my movements. I planned defensively, budgeted conservatively, slept lightly. But now, something had shifted. I was making decisions because they aligned with my future, not because I was protecting myself from his past. I noticed it at work first. I turned down an opportunity that didn't excite me, even though it came with praise and visibility. Old me would have said yes out of habit, afraid of being overlooked. This time, I said no without explanation, and nothing bad happened. The world didn't punish me for choosing myself. That afternoon, I met with a financial advisor, not because I was scared, but because I was ready. We talked about long-term planning, investments, and how to make my money work for me instead of just sitting quietly as insurance against disaster. When she asked about my goals, I didn't mention recovery. I mentioned growth. Later that evening, I reorganized my paperwork and found myself smiling at the irony. The account that once existed as a secret safety net was now becoming part of an intentional plan. It no longer needed to hide. It had done its job. It had carried me through the worst and delivered me here, steady, solvent, and self-directed. My phone buzzed once with an unknown number. I didn't answer. The voicemail came anyway. His voice, careful, resigned. He said he hoped I was doing well, that he was sorting things out, that he wished he'd handled things differently. I deleted it without listening again. Closure had already happened, without his participation. That night, I sat on my balcony, wrapped in a blanket, watching traffic drift by like distant thoughts. I reflected on how easily he'd assumed I would crumble, how confident he'd been that removing money would remove my agency. What he never understood was that money was never my power. Self-trust was. The account didn't save me because it was hidden. It saved me because I listened to myself when something felt off and acted anyway. I didn't build it in fear. I built it in wisdom. As the city lights flickered below, I felt something settle into my chest that had nothing to do with revenge or victory. It was gratitude. For the woman I had been, for the woman I had become, and for the woman I would continue to be, one who would never again confuse love with dependency or silence with safety. I turned off my phone and went inside, knowing the next phase of my life wouldn't require secrecy, because the account he forgot about had already given me everything I needed. And the final lesson was clear. When you trust yourself early, you don't have to panic later. The rest of the story was already mine to write. There was a strange grief that arrived after stability settled in. No one warns you about that part. They tell you about heartbreak, about survival, about rebuilding, but not about the quiet mourning that comes when you realize how long you lived without safety and called it normal. It hit me one evening while folding laundry, something so ordinary it almost slipped past me. I was pairing socks, the TV murmuring in the background, when I realized my chest wasn't tight. My jaw wasn't clenched. I wasn't replaying conversations or rehearsing defenses. I was just existing. And that made me emotional in a way I hadn't expected. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let the tears come. Not sharp, not panicked, but heavy. Tears for the years I spent negotiating my needs. Tears for the times I asked for transparency and accepted reassurance instead. Tears for the woman who sensed danger long before it arrived and quietly prepared alone. I wasn't angry at her. I was proud. In therapy, I talked about the guilt that still surfaced sometimes, the guilt of not warning others, the guilt of not confronting him sooner, the guilt of having it easier because I had that account when so many women don't. My therapist listened, then said gently, "Your preparation doesn't take away from anyone else's pain. It honors your intuition." That reframed everything. I began to understand that my story wasn't about secrecy, it was about self-respect, about listening when something feels off even if you can't explain it yet, about trusting yourself before circumstances force you to. At work, I noticed another shift. I no longer over-explained. I no longer softened my language to be more palatable. I spoke clearly, directly, not harshly, but without shrinking. People responded to that clarity with respect, not resistance. It was a lesson I carried into every room afterward. One afternoon, a friend asked how I managed to land on my feet so quickly. I paused, choosing honesty without detail. I didn't panic. I planned. That was the truth. Panic steals time. Planning gives it back. I finally merged the forgotten account into my broader financial picture, not as an emergency stash anymore, but as a foundation. Watching it integrate felt symbolic. That chapter had served its purpose. It didn't need to hide anymore. Neither did I. The last time I heard his name mentioned, it barely registered. No surge, no reaction, just neutrality. That's when I knew healing had moved from effort to instinct. I didn't win because he failed. I won because I listened to myself when it mattered. That night, I stood by the window and looked out at the city, lights stretching endlessly in every direction. Somewhere out there, he was still trying to rebuild a version of his life that made sense after control failed him. I didn't need to know how that turned out. My story had already shifted into something else entirely. The final chapter wasn't about escape or recovery anymore. It was about ownership of my choices, of my instincts, of my future. And as I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I knew the ending was close, not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was unresolved. I had already stepped fully into the life that account made possible, one built on trust, my own. I don't think healing announces itself. It shows up quietly, in moments you almost miss, when you realize you're no longer bracing for the next blow, when your first thought in the morning isn't fear, when your future feels open instead of conditional. That's how I knew I was done surviving and finally living. The account he forgot about had long since stopped being my safety net. It had become a symbol, not of secrecy, but of foresight, not of fear, but of faith in myself. Every dollar in it represented a moment when I chose my intuition over dismissal, my stability over someone else's comfort. I didn't build it to escape him. I built it to protect me. And in the end, that made all the difference. I no longer replay the night he left or the morning I saw the empty accounts. Those memories have lost their power. They don't define me anymore. They inform me. They remind me of what I'm capable of when I stop outsourcing my safety and start honoring my instincts. He never did find out about that account, and that's okay. Some truths aren't meant to be shared. Some victories are meant to be lived quietly. I don't need him to know how I survived, how I rebuilt, or how I thrived without him. His understanding is not a requirement for my peace. What matters is that I know. I know that I trusted myself long before circumstances demanded it. I know that I didn't panic. I prepared. I know that when everything familiar was stripped away, what remained was strength I'd been carrying all along. That money didn't save me because it was hidden. It saved me because it was mine. And today I live a life built on that same principle. My finances are transparent. My boundaries are firm. My peace is non-negotiable. I don't confuse love with dependence or silence with safety anymore. I am not afraid of starting over. I am proof that when you listen to yourself early, you don't have to beg later. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.